Hi,
Hey,
how's it going?
good. How about you?
It's going well. Yeah, I'm just kind of getting used to what day it is. I felt like it was Wednesday, but it's actually Tuesday.
Pretty
How,
close at least.
yeah, how's everything on your end?
It's going pretty well. Starting to get cold, which is kind of nice actually.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, the air totally changed. I went away for a few days, and just got back, so I'm technically in quarantine. And yeah, it was like it totally shifted. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Well,
Um,
looks like we have a good amount of people trickling in,
yeah,
so I guess we can get started. Um,
sounds good.
for those who follow Field Trip but don't yet follow Rainbow, Tonya is the founder of Rainbow, and they produce mushrooms with unique properties, it sounds like, and also make some supplements and foods with them. So if you want to give a little bit of an intro and talk about what Rainbow's all about.
For sure. Yeah, so hi everyone. Um, as Marshall mentioned, my name is Tonya. I am the founder of a company based in Toronto as well, called Rainbow, and we've been around for about a year and a half, and testing our products for much longer than that. But yeah, we make medicinal mushroom products. We sustainably cultivate all of our mushrooms here in Canada, so it's a mix of kind of Quebec and Ontario. And I mean, there's so much to say, but that's kind of the gist of what we do. We're a small team that's based here and have some exciting stuff that we're going to be, just putting out in the next few months. And I'm really excited to have this chat with you. It's apparently National Mushroom Month. So I feel like this conversation will be well timed, and I have just tons of questions for you because I'm so intrigued with what Field Trip is doing, and I've just seen a lot of great stuff, the app, and yeah, we'll get into all of that.
Yeah, for sure. I think we're kind of at this intersectional space because we both work with mushrooms in some
Right.
capacity and both have a focus on overall health and well-being and how
Hmm.
mushrooms can play a role in that. Um,
Totally.
so one of the
And we should
questions,
also, sorry, invite people to ask questions if they have them,
yeah,
um,
definitely.
please.
Yeah, so if you have questions, throw them into the question box and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So how do you get into this in the first place? What makes you so interested in mushrooms?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been studying, I've been really interested in health for like 15 years. So it goes way back to when I was a teenager, and I always had a lot of questions about just like how things worked. And based on my own experiences, I just needed to find answers for healing, for my own healing and for my own sensitivities in my body. So that got me really in tune with using food as medicine when I was like 16, 15. And because of those experiences, that kind of got me on the trajectory of just like wanting to learn more about biology and human physiology and the ways that food affects us. So I went to school and studied nutrition and nutraceutical sciences. And it's so funny because when I was graduating university, I was like, oh, nutraceuticals, like, I won't ever do that. Like, it's just so funny. It's so funny that I've landed here, and I just love like we just things always come full circle, and it's a theme that I always know that if something isn't feeling like the right thing or is transitioning out, it will eventually, that knowledge will come back in some way. Um, and so yeah, I think at that point, totally, if you had told me like, oh, you're gonna have a mushroom company, I would have been like, excuse me. But yeah, so it was a long kind of journey into um, learning about science and nutrition has been my focus for, I mean, my whole educational and most of my career. So then went back to school after that and studied holistic nutrition, because as I kind of progressed through my 20s, just started learning more about yoga and taking a more holistic approach to how I was living, and went back to school. And then like it was in that time period too where um, do you know do you know David Avocado Wolf?
No.
Okay, so not really sure if too many people are familiar with him, but he's the first person who I ever heard say the words shaga in like 2012, and I was like, my ears perked up, and he like threw all these crazy facts out, and I was like, whoa, that sounds really cool. I would like to have some chaga tea. And then we ended up, a few friends, we ended up becoming a good friend of his, and so he taught us actually how to forage. And he has like a bunch of classic medicinal mushroom books. So I learned a lot from him, learned about foraging through him. And then when I was kind of like doing more of my own healing, got into medicinal mushrooms just for healing myself. And then yeah, I mean, I just started researching. This was like end of 2017. My process for everything in life is very intuitive, and like I really tune into what I'm feeling and let that kind of guide my interests and where things go. So I just kind of dove into research and books, and was so like just completely enamored, which I feel like so many mushroom people get that way, where they're like, the mushrooms speak to me. And you just feel like, a kinship and a working togetherness with the mushroom. So yeah, it feels like a process that's been unfolding for many years. And also just like, the business side of things is totally another whole realm of, a process that has taken me a while to build up and have great people around to execute and all of that. So yeah, that's a gist of how I got into it. What about you?
Yeah, I think similar. I got into it in a similar way in that it was very much not predicted, not expected. I was really interested in the brain and psychiatry and different psychiatric disorders, and basically how we perceive the world around us and how that can change over time. And naturally, psychedelics fit into that really well. So some strong early experiences with psychedelics led me down that route. And I always had an interest in biology and mycology. I think, like you alluded to this, but it's always been kind of this, not always, but it's sort of this mysterious realm where a lot of it's unknown. It's hard to find many schools that even offer like a mycology major, and so it's difficult to get a lot of information. You kind of have to make a little more effort than you would if you were studying like botany or something like that, or biology. So
Totally.
mycology operates in this kind of niche space, which I find really intriguing, and clearly you do too. So eventually, yeah, through a pretty circuitous process, I ended up here researching psychedelics down in our lab in Jamaica.
Amazing.
And I think there's some synergies in that we look at psychedelics as tools to improve overall well-being and particularly mental health, but that goes hand in hand with physical health.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, a lot of the products that you're looking into are just kind of beginning to be explored scientifically, but have been used historically for, thousands of years,
Mm-hmm.
to promote well-being. And so it's this really interesting space
Yeah.
where not too much is known because not too much research has actually been done on a lot of these, and more needs to be done because clearly there's a lot of potential here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the type of rigor, of like scientific rigor that's required, as you know, to bring what you are working on to the market is so different than a natural health product. Um, and I mean, it's very fascinating because both are natural substances, and just alter our chemistry and biology in different ways. But yeah, it's exciting. There's a lot more research coming out, which is really promising. But yes, definitely a very long historical use case of these mushrooms, which is really, really amazing. And so, did you actually, your background, like you researched, what was your background in school? Like you became a researcher, and was it, um, yeah, didn't you get
Yeah.
your PhD in something or
Yeah,
other?
so my degrees are in chemical biology. And so chemical biology is a little bit distinct from biochemistry. A lot of people get the two confused, but chemical biology is using small molecules to understand how biology works. So basically using small molecules as probes to manipulate various receptors and proteins and whatnot, and try to get an understanding of how things work. So a lot of the research I did was with psychiatric disorders, where we were taking cells from patients and actually culturing them in a lab. And so you could get patient specific brain cells in a lab growing on a dish. And you could see how those differed from someone without a similar diagnosis. So for example, if someone presented with depression, we could grow out their neurons on a dish and compare that to someone without depression and see where their difference is and what molecules can we use to help understand why these differences are there and how we might be able to restore some of the differences to make the depression neurons look a little more like the non-depression neurons. And so that was what really intrigued me. And I think the looking at, you know, psilocybin and various other psychedelics to really explore these fundamental biological mechanisms that go on in the brain is where my interest has lay for quite some time.
That's really cool. And so what is happening in Jamaica? Will you tell us about the research that you're focusing on there?
Yeah, definitely. So in Jamaica, we are working with the University of West Indies down there to do research into psychoactive fungi. So I think typically in the realm of psychoactive fungi, most people think of psilocybe cubensis. They also might think of Amanita muscaria, even though it's not really well understood. But Amanita muscaria is the bright red mushroom with all the white dots on top of it. So the classic Mario mushroom that everyone thinks of. But in terms of psychoactive effects, I think most people think of psilocybe cubensis. It's the primary species that people use when they're consuming magic mushrooms. So in Jamaica, we're going far beyond that and looking into all known species of psilocybin producing mushrooms because there are over 180 different species, and that's just one of them. So we're really delving into that. And we're hoping to delve into some of the cool species like Amanita muscaria as well. So we're doing some preliminary work on that. A little more difficult to explore just because it requires a symbiosis with tree roots. So it's hard to cultivate in a lab. But really interesting chemistry and something that we're looking into.
That's
and so,
really...
yeah, the hope is that we'll understand at the end a lot of the nuances of the chemical makeup of these fungi that might contribute to the overall experience that people get when they consume them. Because the sort of underlying hypothesis is that consuming these psychoactive mushrooms gives you a different experience than consuming synthetic psilocybin in isolation. And so we're exploring the complex botanical side rather than focusing on single molecules, because we think there's a lot of potential benefit that you can get from consuming all of these molecules together, like you would in many of your products where you're getting, you know, not just one isolated molecule, you're getting this extract that contains dozens, if not hundreds of different molecules in it.
Yeah, I'm so happy. Is that your hypothesis? Is that there is a difference, or are you even kind of going there?
Yeah. So that's definitely the hypothesis, is that there's a difference.
Amazing.
And anecdotally, there's a lot of evidence to suggest there is. If you talk to people who have consumed a lot of different species, they'll say, yeah, there's definitely a difference, and I could tell you for sure. But of course, that hasn't been validated scientifically. And so we're hoping to add a little bit more credibility or to disprove it. You know, we have to keep an open mind and think it could be the case that there really is no difference, or that the difference is more negative than positive.
I'm happy. It's an interesting one, and a conversation that I've had many times with different people. And I think ultimately, you have to take the scientific approach and be open to exploring where those differences lay and how it may affect the experience. But my strong belief and my personal preference would be towards taking a whole plant or a whole mushroom, because there's just so many synergies in the chemicals and how they interact in the body that we haven't studied or we don't know about that are so interesting. And you know, I would imagine, but I guess I could be wrong, that would influence the person's experience and trip in some way.
Yeah, I would think so. And I think cannabis provides a kind of a good example there, where, I mean, it's still really unclear with cannabis, just because the science has lagged behind a little bit, exactly what molecules are contributing in what way to the overall experience. But it used to be thought that it was just THC, and that THC was the only molecule that really contributed to the psychoactive effects. But then when THC was made in isolation in the form of a prescription drug, people actually didn't like it nearly as much as the whole plant. And so they found that the effects definitely differed between the two. And
Mm-hmm.
so now we know that there are over 100 different cannabinoids that are contributing to the experience, or potentially contributing to the experience. And so I think a very similar thing is probably at play with a lot of these fungi.
Yeah. So will Field Trip be putting on any clinical studies of your own based on any of the findings or the compounds that you're really curious in working with or building out in some capacity?
Yeah, that's definitely the hope. So if we find anything really promising when we're doing our chemical analyses, we definitely want to push that through studies to see how it actually performs in animals and then ultimately in humans. So it's definitely something we're looking at. We do have a whole drug development arm of the company where we look into novel psychedelic molecules that might have special benefits over the ones that are currently being explored in clinical trials, like psilocybin and MDMA. So we're exploring a few others that we think have, special added benefits beyond that. And if we found anything within the mushroom itself that we felt similarly about, we would definitely go that route.
Cool. Um, yeah, that's fascinating. There was a question from someone saying, just what are the ways that somebody can be a part and help move the industry forward? What do you think is I mean, it sounds like research is just starting to happen again after however, like 50-year stint of not being able to research these compounds. But what would you say um, is a way that this industry will move forward?
So we're talking about the psychedelics industry, I guess, rather than
Yeah,
just the mushroom industry as a whole.
yeah, and I can speak to that side of it too.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess I'll touch on the psychedelic side. I think it's pretty unclear right now how it's going to progress. Like there's some clarity in that we know that psychedelics are really powerful drugs. And so, um, unlike some other drugs, it's safest when they're administered in a pretty controlled environment. And obviously, that's not the only way they can be administered. And people have had really transformational, beneficial experiences in totally uncontrolled settings. But in general, before we understand it, the safest way to go about it is to administer them in these nice, controlled environments that are designed to minimize anxiety and other kind of adverse reactions that might lead to long-term issues. Largely psychological, because most of these molecules don't really pose much, if any, physical harm, at least when they're taken irregularly, like once every few months or once every few years. But they do pose potential psychological risk just because they do create such a profound shift in consciousness. They can be really tricky to work with if you don't have the proper framework around them. And so I think one of the spaces that this industry is going to go towards is having these controlled environments, these controlled settings where people can use these molecules. And that's one of the things we're actually trying to do at Field Trip. We're setting up clinics in both Canada and the US, and ultimately in other countries, where we're trying to control the experience in such a way that it's maximizing the positive effects of these molecules, and then minimizing any sort of negative adverse reactions. So I think that's one clear way that this movement will go. But then there's also a lot of uncertainties in that we don't know, like, if we don't know which molecules are ultimately going to be legalized. We don't know if they're going to be legalized strictly for medical purposes, or if there's going to be a sort of framework around them that allows for their use in non-medical settings, in more recreational type settings. And I think regardless, though, there's going to be a demand for these physical spaces where people can use these molecules and feel very safe using these molecules, because for a lot of people, this is going to be a very new experience and very transformational experience. And so, yeah, there's that side of it. And then the basic science side, doing the fundamental research into the biology and chemistry of all these different organisms, and different molecules, and how they're affecting the brain and the body, and how those two interplay with each other. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty, but a lot of work to be done. It makes it more fun, I think, being in a sort of industry where it's not clear what the future is going to be. It's more up in the air, because it's exciting and you have to be ready for everything, as I'm
Totally.
sure you get a feel for in your space too.
Yeah, I mean, it's slightly different, but it's also, you know, Yeah, I think the way that I would answer this question would be similarly that a lot more research is required. And I would say one of the hurdles for us, it's also one of our commitments at Rainbow, is that we are cultivating and growing our mushrooms in North America, in Canada specifically. And that has been challenging in lots of different ways, but for the mushroom industry as a whole and at large right now, most of medicinal mushrooms are coming from China, and they have been cultivating and growing and like having these farms exist in different parts of China for 50 to 100 years. So their level of knowledge for the cultivation process is just far beyond what we see and what we have here in North America. So I'm excited for just like more innovation around the mushroom cultivation industry in North America. I'm excited for some of our next steps towards just different, like the way we're progressing, and some of my visions for what Rainbow will eventually be and become. And then aside from that, like, yeah, definitely research. Research is so key. And as we, it's interesting with Health Canada, like there's not that much. It's actually kind of challenging to combine herbs and mushrooms. There's not that much clinical evidence that shows the efficacy of that. And I think like I definitely struggle a little bit with combining the worlds of like herbal medicine and more folk and traditional medicine with the scientific method. And so I'm excited to see that develop and move along because, yeah, it's a challenge to experience something, and we'll run little tests and we'll get our feedback from people. But beyond that, it can be challenging to have that extend to mass amounts of people. And so, I mean, that side of it, just testing. There's different regulations. Canada and the US have different regulations, and that is its own kind of different regulatory body. And so, yeah, those are the two big ones for how I would be.
So on the cultivation side, it sounds like you said you're interested in exploring, innovations in the cultivation space. Are you guys actively doing R&D on that?
Not yet, no. That's still very much in the pipeline for where I want Rainbow to move, and I mean that's going to require a different budget and just a different build out process. So that's still very much, something that I'm slowly working to put the pieces together on, like how, where, when, and building out kind of a whole facility around that. So that will be pipeline kind of stuff. And yeah, but I mean, it takes time too. Like, how are you? So in Jamaica, I imagine you have like various mycologists or staff of some sort, like actually cultivating and growing.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's actually really interesting because in Jamaica, they really don't use mushrooms for much of anything. Like even in their cuisine, it's very rare to find mushrooms in Jamaican cuisine. And so the whole idea of mycology is totally foreign to most people who live on the island or who are native to the island. But we have trained some mycologists, well, now mycologists from the university who are helping us out down there. Yeah.
Really cool. Um, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a way to, I mean, there's so many benefits to it, I think, in terms of just like ensuring your quality and your all of your processes being followed extremely strictly, and really being able to just have that vertical integration is really adds a level of complexity and a level of just, I think, control within your business that's really um, an exciting piece to work towards.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know like with psychedelic mushrooms, what we found is that even between individual mushrooms picked from a single culture, you can get huge chemical variation. So you can get a variation of, as much as 3 times in terms of psilocybin content. So
That's so
basically one
fascinating.
mushroom can be, 3 times as potent as another from the very same culture
Wow.
grown in a very controlled environment. Um,
Wow,
And so
that's so wild. So what is that? What are the functions that are happening with the mycelium for them to be like sending more nutrients to a certain part of the fungus?
yeah, that's like one of the open questions is, I mean, at a very basic level, it's not totally understood why mushrooms are producing psilocybin in the first place. It's thought that it might have some sort of anti-predation effect where certain insects will eat it and then it'll act as an appetite suppressant, and so they won't return to the space, or it might interfere with memory formation, and so they don't remember where they found the mushroom to eat in the first place. Um, but that's purely hypothetical right now. It's
Mm-hmm.
still not totally clear why the mushrooms produce psilocybin. So I think once there's a little more clarity around that, we might understand exactly what environmental triggers are leading to increased production in some mushrooms and decrease in others. But for now, it's a totally open question. And I imagine very similar chemical differences exist with some of the medicinal mushrooms that you're cultivating. I wouldn't be surprised if there is pretty strong variation in the chemical content between different mushrooms.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised either. Yeah, given it's likely that that happens. And um, I mean, you can also see like every mushroom has its own like level of growth, or
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, depending on how big it gets, it can vary greatly from its neighboring mushroom arm. So yeah, that's very, very fascinating. It would make sense too to extend to like the nutritional compounds as well. If you're having a culinary, if you're growing an oyster mushroom, um,
Right.
have like this one freaky arm that's just grown extremely large. Um, so yeah, that's really interesting. Um,
And are all your products, are they all from the fruiting body or some of them based on the
all,
mycelium?
all of them are from the fruiting body except for agarikon, which would take very long time to grow, and we don't want to source that from um, you would source it from old growth forests, but it's just not worth it to us because of I mean, there's not too many left, and yeah, we wouldn't. It's not really a sustainable method to be wildcrafting agarikon. And then shaga, we are wildcrafting our shaga, so that one we're not actually cultivating in the labs. And then aside from that, we use fruiting body for everything else. And for our lion's mane, we recently started adding mycelium into the lion's mane as well, because there's been some studies that have shown that the mycelium is actually also showing medicinal benefits. It's almost entirely fruiting body, but we have added some mycelium as well. And then we also utilize some reishi spores. So like our reishi is, I have some here actually. I don't know if people will be able to see it, but our reishi actually has a lot of, probably won't be able to see it, but there's a lot of like little spores in there and little pieces of mushroom particles. So we actually do add the spores back in and try and get some of the actual mushroom compounds into the tincture as well, because they can have some benefits in addition to the extracted liquid. But yeah, that was a process that is, I mean, I think it's fairly intuitive and makes sense, and scientifically, like it's what the research has shown is that the medicinal benefits are coming from the fruiting bodies. But um, definitely a few companies, anyways, that do utilize mycelium as well. And again, it could very well be that there are medicinal properties in the mycelium as well. But my guess would be that they would be slightly different. And but I am really interested in seeing some research in that to
Yeah.
really prove it. But
Yeah,
there's not much
likewise.
at this point.
And I guess just to take a step back for anyone who doesn't totally understand the mushroom growth cycle. So the mycelium is the part of the mushroom that you don't actually see, or you generally don't see because it's underground. Whereas the fruiting body that we're referring to is the actual mushroom with the, in some cases, cap and stem, in other cases, different form, but the part of the mushroom that's either above ground or on the outside of a tree or whatnot. And so, yeah, I've heard there is a lot of controversy around the whole mycelium versus fruiting body. And a lot of times the issue with mycelium, I guess, is that you might be able to speak better to it, but the way it's sold is it's myceliated grain. And so it's mycelium that's been grown on grain. And so most of what you end up consuming is the grain, like brown rice, for example, rather than the mycelium. The mycelium is just on top of the grain. And so it's basically diluted in that way. Whereas with the fruiting body, you're getting, 100% mushroom biomass.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the structure of the mushroom itself, and the cell wall is really what you're like those beta glucans are what you're aiming to extract from the mushrooms, as well as the other beneficial compounds. But it doesn't even really like the content of beta glucans and mycelium is intuitively much less than what would be found in the in a mature kind of fruiting body grown mushroom. So yeah, it's really interesting. Somebody here asked a good question about just the difference between potency of powders versus extracts, which is a great question. And both can be equally potent, really. It totally just depends on the individual's preference. I have done a lot of research into this because, of course, when we were figuring out like what we want this end product and how we want people to consume it and how we want that process to be easy and really effortless, tincture for me made the most sense because it's high absorbability, can get into the bloodstream fairly quickly if you're doing it sublingually, and the mushrooms are in their extracted forms via like a dual extract of water, of a water extract and alcohol. So potency is high with tinctures for sure. It kind of just comes down to your preference levels, and if you are getting powders, just making sure that you're actually asking the questions to the manufacturer or the brand about how are these mushrooms extracted? Are they extracted? Do I need to brew this into a tea? Because some companies out there are just selling pure mushroom, like shaga mushroom or reishi mushrooms that's just been ground. And so if you ingest that, you're not actually going to be getting any of the beneficial compounds because it hasn't been extracted. So at the very least would need to be made into a decoction or a tea of some sort. So just making sure that you're asking the right questions, and finding out how the mushrooms are extracted, and because that's very important, and dual extraction is preferred. And then I think for us, ease of tinctures and how easy we've seen people being able to integrate that into their lifestyles and mornings and routines has been almost effortless, because you can just drop it into your water bottle or your tea or your coffee, and be able to just make it functional and get a dose of mushrooms into your day and into your body pretty easily. So that's our preference.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's obviously there aren't many people who are selling psychoactive mushrooms in the same sort of format, at least not in legal markets. But you face a different sort of issue with psilocybin because it's so readily oxidized and degraded that as soon as you make an extract or anything like that, it's very susceptible to degradation if it's not properly stored and everything. Whereas I think a lot of the medicinal compounds that you're working with probably have a much better shelf life than psilocybin.
Yeah. So I guess it would have to be encapsulated right away then for psilocybin.
Yeah, ideally, and then stored in a very dry environment. Like as soon as water comes into the equation, that's when you start seeing a lot of degradation.
And I was going to ask a question about that. What would be like, so if you, for a capsule, let's just say, that's in an airtight bottle, how long would something like that last if you're opening it daily?
It's a good question. A lot of those studies haven't really been done, so I can only give approximations. I think like the most important thing is rapid drying, because as soon as you harvest the mushroom, it still has the enzymes in it, which will degrade psilocybin. So naturally, the mushroom contains enzymes that will break psilocybin down, and they break it down to psilocin, which is then much more susceptible to degradation. And so if you quickly dry the mushrooms, you can get rid of those enzymes. You basically deactivate them, and then you're good to go. Like the psilocybin is fairly safe there, and could actually last for months, if not years. But if you don't rapidly dry them, the water within the mushroom will keep the enzymes alive, and while they're alive, they're still breaking down psilocybin. And so those sorts of mushrooms, they can't be stored for more than a few days or weeks without losing substantial amounts of the active molecules.
Well, yeah, that's really interesting.
Then I think, yeah, there was one question that someone asked on different species of mushrooms, and whether there's this common saying is a cube, because people refer to Psilocybe cubensis as a cube. And so a lot of people say that it doesn't really matter what strain of Psilocybe cubensis you're eating, whether it's Golden Teacher, Penis Envy, or B+, whatever it might be, you're going to get similar effects. And we found that that's probably the case, at least the early evidence is showing that's probably the case for those different strains, because those are all strains within a given species. They all belong to Psilocybe cubensis. But if you look between species, that's where you really start to see profound chemical differences that might definitely change the overall experience.
There's a good question here that I would love for you to answer. Lemon teching. So like, what is the interaction with psilocybin and lemon, and why does it, I guess, like expedite the process so well and so quickly, and kind of like bring on those effects so fast?
Yeah, it's a good question. I know a lot of people are into that now. A lot of people who do lemon teching, so mixing basically lemon juice with ground mushrooms, usually adding a little bit of water, they claim that it hits a lot faster and a lot harder than if you just consume the mushrooms whole. And there is some evidence that that might be the case for a few different reasons. So one, the lemon juice might liberate the psilocybin from the mushroom more readily. So like basically psilocybin, when it's in, even if it's in these dried particles that have been ground up, it's still kind of encapsulated. It's got all these other molecules surrounding it. But as soon as you add an acid, it readily breaks away from all of these other molecules that are encapsulating it. And so it becomes much more...
Maybe breaking up.
Sorry, what was that?
I'm not sure if it's breaking up for other people. No, I'm having a hard time hearing this because it's breaking up quite a bit, or you're breaking up quite a bit. I'm not sure if it is for everybody else.
Okay.
Maybe
yeah, I'm not
people
sure
can
either.
let us know if they heard that. We can hear you. Okay.
Yeah.
So it should be fine. Maybe it's just my connection. Okay.
Yeah.
So will you?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So
Will
one
you?
of the thoughts is that the lemon juice might be kind of liberating the psilocybin from all this other mushroom biomass and making it much more readily available. Another thought is that it might be basically psilocybin, the molecule in itself, is not psychoactive, but it's psilocin, which is what it breaks down to, that's psychoactive. So when you ingest psilocybin, your body's actually breaking it down into psilocin. And so it has to do that chemical conversion before you'll feel any effect at all. But lemon juice might speed up that chemical conversion. So it might allow it to be broken down more rapidly. And in doing so, you feel the effects more quickly because your body doesn't have to do that extra step of breaking down psilocybin. So there's some early evidence. Most of it is anecdotal, though, in terms of whether the lemon tech. Science has yet to tell us whether it is for sure.
Sorry, my phone is doing something really weird. I think I'll. Anyways, I can hear you now.
Okay.
It sounds like, yeah, people were losing the sound for a bit there. I don't know. It sounded really muffly, but that's okay. We can just keep moving forward because you're back. Okay, I have a question for you. What is, in your research with mushrooms or with psilocybin, what is the strangest or coolest, or like, just, have you had any like jaw-dropping moments so far where, yeah, what's been like the coolest thing that you've discovered or found? Okay, wait. I'm having a really hard time hearing. Can you say something? I'm gonna check my connection. Somebody thinks it's your microphone. Try getting back in and coming on.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yep, now it's good.
You guys can hear
now
me?
that seems great. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I think my Bluetooth headphones connected by accident.
Okay, I was like, I feel like we're dropping into somebody's conversation. Okay, yes. So I asked that question and then you started to laugh.
Okay, so the question was if I had any specific experiences with mushrooms.
Yeah, well, it could be an experience, or just any of the research that you've either found, or like what's come out of Jamaica, or just like really exciting things, something that's just like had your jaw dropped, because it's just like a cool kind of thing that you're amazed by.
It's a good question. It's a hard one.
I know. If you ask me, I don't know what my answer is yet.
Yeah, and stuff that's like jaw-dropping for me might not be as exciting for other
Right.
people. So like one of the things that I find really intriguing is that some of these species that we're growing, they produce a lot of psilocybin in the mycelium, whereas other species will only produce it in the mushroom. And so to me, that's like a really fascinating question of why are some species producing so much in this underground part, whereas other species are only producing it in this fruiting body. And so far it's unclear, but that really intrigues me. So I think that's one of them. Another one, not to do with psilocybin mushrooms, but with Amanita muscaria in particular, that we touched on a little bit earlier. I think it's really fascinating because if you look through experience reports and sort of historical use of this mushroom, it's so varied. Like some people have awful experiences. Some people don't feel anything at all. Some people have like incredibly entheogenic experiences where they feel like they're one with God. And so you get like this huge variety of experiences from this mushroom. And it seems like a lot of it might come down to preparation, or potentially, the environment that it's grown in, and seasonality and that sort of thing. But there's just so many open questions there, and it's not as easy to study, like I mentioned earlier, because you can't grow it in a lab. And I think like that makes it even more elusive and mysterious and kind of exciting. And the molecules it produces act in totally different ways than psilocybin. So they don't act on the serotonin system like psilocybin does. They act on two different systems actually. And so that to me is really fascinating, that there's so much that hasn't really been explored and is poorly understood, but there's clearly a rich history of use of this mushroom. It's not even as well documented though as the historical use of psilocybin containing mushrooms.
That's so fascinating that some of the mushrooms produce psilocybin in their mycelial state. Would that be like, is there any difference in the quality of that psilocybin to be used therapeutically, or are they just the exact same molecules? Because that would save, I mean, a huge amount of potentially time, and like, I mean, yeah, if you just grew the mycelium, psilocybin from mycelium, it would be slightly different, right?
Yeah. So it would save a huge amount of time, because then you wouldn't have to encourage them to grow mushrooms. Like the hardest thing to do is to basically make a lot of these species actually grow mushrooms, but they'll
Yeah,
readily grow mycelium on almost
totally.
anything. So yeah, that would save a lot of time. We do find that there are some chemical differences, and it's unclear how that will translate to actual like experiential differences. But for example, some studies from Germany suggest that the mycelium contains more monoamine oxidase inhibitors than the mushroom. And so those inhibitors actually, they bind to the enzyme in the human body that normally breaks down serotonin. And so by binding to that enzyme, they basically they allow serotonin to stay around for longer and more serotonin to accumulate. And so your body ends up producing more serotonin. And those enzymes are also the same enzymes that are responsible for breaking down psilocybin, the psychoactive molecule from mushrooms. And so that also stays around longer and might have a more potent effect, and more of it might get to the brain when you consume the mycelium versus the mushroom. But those are all open questions. But there are definitely chemical differences between the mycelium and the mushrooms. Yeah, and
Yeah,
I'd love to see more of that work done on a lot of the mushrooms that you're working with, to see those chemical differences between the mushrooms and mycelium.
yeah. And now I'm like, oh, maybe we'll start growing our mushrooms in Jamaica. um, yeah. I mean, it's so incredible that you have the tools, right? Like to be actually studying that in your laboratories. That's really really something pretty special. Because, well, I mean, I imagine that's what you're doing. You're not outsourcing like this stuff. You can actually look at um, these um, these compounds within the laboratory setting.
Yeah, we're doing all the cultivation, extraction, and analysis in-house. We're like constantly accumulating new equipment and more equipment, because it does require some pretty high-tech analytical equipment. And it's not cheap, but it's definitely cool work.
Yeah, yeah. That's really cool. Um, so there's a
And
few other
then
questions.
I had a question for you. So
Yeah.
obviously your mushrooms and the tinctures and whatnot that you make out of them, they have some sort of effect that a lot of different people seem to enjoy very much. And so how do you kind of test like new tincture recipes or new food recipes for that effect, and what you think it might do to most people? Like, are you just trying these yourself and seeing how they influence you, or are you basing it on some sort of fundamental
You, you
literature?
yeah, you mean like our products themselves, right? Not like
Yeah, yeah,
food recipes. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
So um, yeah, I mean, honestly, most of it is based off of fundamental like research that exists around how to use these tinctures and these mushrooms. Um, it's kind of interesting because mushrooms, like across the board, have so many health benefits. And so to like really kind of box them into saying like, well, this mushroom's an adaptogen and it's going to help you for stress, and this one's like immunity focused. You have shaga for that, or turkey tail, let's just say. Um, it's challenging to like box them into the names, and yet that really helps customers decide like how they want to and how they can use the mushrooms. But in terms of us actually, figuring out our products, and the recipes and the intended uses, most of it is based on research. And that's why it is a little bit easier for natural health products and to bring those products to market. Before I launched Rainbow, I had a pilot study, and this was like me literally running this with a whole range of people, from doctors and naturopathic doctors and health professionals to just friends and people interested in mushrooms who wanted to try and provide their feedback on what their experiences were, if they felt anything, if they did, what was it, if they didn't, just any changes that they experienced. So um, that was how part of how the process of 1111 came about, and how I learned just how loved that product would be based on so many of our results that came through our pilot before we launched. And then after that, with any of our single ingredient tinctures, it hasn't really been as much of a testing phase for those, to be honest. those are mostly just based off of the literature, and doing like getting some of our lab analyses back to show the active compounds and the beta glucans, and then slowly trying to work to be like, okay, we like these numbers, but how can we make this better, and how can we grow our mushrooms in a different way potentially, so that we can really have the effects and the compounds that we want. How can we, you know, extract more efficiently or grow more efficiently? And so those are like the 5 products that we have right now. And then we also have our forest juice, which is the maple syrup infused with medicinal mushrooms. And that one's just, you know, a functional food essentially. So a way to infuse your maple syrup. We actually decoct the mushrooms and the syrup at the same time. And that one is not a novel food. Like, I don't know if you know much about the whole like Health Canada categorization of like natural health products versus novel foods and all of that. But that one it's a great introductory product too, if somebody's not familiar with how to take mushrooms and just wants a really yummy way and mechanism to get it into their bodies, but it's not as strong. You're not getting like as, you know, a daily dose of your mushrooms. If you wanted that, we would definitely suggest the tinctures. And then furthermore, I guess down the line, that is something that we're, you know, as we release more products, that will be a process that, you know, I would love to be able to run a clinical study of our own at some point when we have, you know, to be able to prove the effects of mushrooms and herbs combined and what those synergies really are. We will have to do some type of clinical studies in the future to put those products together, and to also show to Health Canada that you can combine these ingredients safely, and if that's like a whole process. But
yeah, sounds like a cumbersome process, but would be really interesting to see the results.
Yeah. There's been so many good questions. I wish we could answer them all. Oh, I actually have a question for you, although we all want to get to these as well. But so Field Trip is working with mushrooms, and what other plant medicines, or any medicines for that matter?
Yeah, so right now we're basically working with, we're interested in exploring anything that's psychedelic or could potentially be used as a psychedelic, and that's a really, really broad scope. So right now at our clinics, for example, we're using ketamine as a psychedelic in the form of ketamine enhanced psychotherapy. So the idea is, in the right dose and administered in the setting like we have in our clinics, people can have these transformative psychedelic experiences with ketamine. And these are generally people who are suffering from depression or PTSD. And so they'll go through a ketamine session, a transformative journey, and then afterwards they have integration sessions with a psychotherapist where they can actually integrate a lot of their findings and insights that they had during their psychedelic journey with ketamine. So ketamine is a big one that we're working with right now. But as I said earlier, we're setting up this sort of clinical infrastructure with clinics around the US, Canada, and ultimately elsewhere, so that we can administer not just ketamine, but any psychedelic that ends up becoming approved for use in humans. So psilocybin right now, for example, is in clinical trials. And as soon as it makes it through clinical trials and gets approved, which it seems like it should, as a potential antidepressant treatment, we'll be doing psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy at our clinic. So it's really just a matter of time and keeping a really close eye on how legislation is progressing, because we obviously have to operate within the law. But we are very interested in all psychedelics, and also other botanicals. Like mushrooms are the starting point for us. The psilocybin fungi we're exploring in Jamaica, but we also realize that there are a lot of organisms besides mushrooms that produce really interesting psychedelic compounds. So for example, cacti is an area of a lot of interest for many of us at the company, and we're intending to explore that at some point, but we obviously have to have a starting point because there's a lot of work that goes into each project. But in the long run, we really want to have a sort of comprehensive understanding of all these different organisms and different molecules.
That's amazing. That's so exciting. And how does somebody who qualifies to come into Field Trip and come for a session? How do people get in? How do who? Yeah, and what are you? Is there a common theme with what you're treating right now? It sounds like it's mental health.
Yeah. So right now we're treating mental health conditions, largely depression, especially in our Toronto clinic. And a lot of these people present with treatment-resistant depression. So they've tried at least 2 antidepressant treatments and they failed. And so what they'll do is they'll go to fieldtriphealth.com, and then you can get started from there, and you can figure out if you're eligible for the field trip treatment. So you'll meet with one of our clinical specialists who will determine whether or not you'd be eligible for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And if you are, then you could go through the program. But yeah, as a starting point, you can always reach out through our website, fieldtriphealth.com. And you can find a lot of really good information there and a lot of educational material too. Because one of the big things we're trying to do is educate people on psychedelics. And sort of, it's like a really, it's a re-emerging field. And so we've learned a lot from the early trials that have been done with psychedelics, but there's also a lot of open questions when it comes to using them, because unlike other drugs like typical antidepressants like SSRIs, you can prescribe them, take them once or twice a day, and it's kind of regardless of setting. So you don't have this same sort of attention paid to set and setting. It's just you take this drug once or twice a day, usually for months or even years. For many people, a lot of times it's not effective. It's a very different process when it comes to psychedelics. The psychedelics are not taken nearly as frequently. It depends on the psychedelic and the particular treatment protocol, but generally they're not taken nearly as frequently as typical antidepressants. And then afterwards, the integration is such a key component. It's like going on this huge journey, this psychological journey, and then having this integration session where you can actually incorporate those insights into behavioral changes and changes in thought patterns that are actually meaningful in your daily life. That's so important. So yeah, there's a lot of open areas of exploration. We're trying to basically learn from what's been done and also push the needle a little bit forward with the educational front, because even ketamine, a lot of people don't see it as a psychedelic because the way it's been administered typically is as an anesthetic. And so for so long, it hasn't really been viewed in that way. It was used recreationally for a period of time and still is used recreationally as a psychedelic, but a lot of people, especially in the medical world, don't view it that way. And so that's been a sort of hurdle, is to help people understand that ketamine, when used in intentional way, can really be psychedelic, tremendously psychedelic, as much or more so than many other molecules that we typically considered psychedelic, like psilocybin and LSD and whatnot.
So you're administering like a rather high dose then of ketamine to
yeah, so I mean, it really
achieve that?
depends, and it's our clinical team, assesses each patient and what their particular needs might be, because for some patients, a higher dose might definitely be warranted. For others, it might be safer to start at a lower dose. So it really depends. But yeah, we try to use a dose that will encourage this sort of transformational experience.
Yeah, wow, it's really amazing work what you guys are doing, what you're all doing.
And then,
I can also can't believe an hour has gone by. I feel like this could be much longer.
yeah, could definitely talk forever. I did have another question if you still have some time.
Yeah, I do. Yeah,
Okay,
I
cool.
think we have like a minute or two, so let's see.
Okay, cool. So, oh yeah, minute 22, yeah. All right. So, do you collect any, you said you're interested eventually in doing like, some more clinical work with your products and stuff. Do you collect any data right now from your consumers who are using the products?
It's actually such an amazing idea, and we should be we should put something in place where we do that more regularly. But at this point, we have done, I believe, 1 or 2 just like kind of research, sending out a questionnaire to gather information from our current customers who've been using our products once, twice, consistently, some for over a year. And we get a lot of that feedback, whether they're emailing me or sending us reviews onto their site or onto our site or whatever in whatever kind of way, but we don't have a definitive tool. And it's a really, really good idea actually, to as a way to monitor and collect some of that kind of, you know, use case information on how they're affecting people.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think one of the great things about the sort of space you're in is like people have to be pretty motivated, or a lot of times are pretty motivated if they start seeking out your sorts of products for bettering their well-being. So they might also have this sort of motivation that you'd need to encourage them to complete a survey or something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, I'd
Yeah.
love to see the data on that, to see what people are feeling from the products and how
Yeah.
it varies between different people.
Yeah, it's honestly one of my like one of the most um heartwarming and like fulfilling parts of like my everyday experience is having reviews come in and just reading the ways that our products are positively impacting people's lives, from people with ADHD to anxiety to people who just have a hard time getting up in the morning, um, people who are just bringing more like sacred ritual into their mornings, um, down to, I mean, mood and immunity. So it is it's yeah, it's a really good idea to have a tool to like really capture more of that in a more scientific way to build that out, and um, yeah, to even for like future product formulation.
Very cool. Yeah, so definitely keep us updated on that front,
I
and
will.
any way we can be involved, I'm sure we'd love to. So
Yeah.
yeah, I guess it will sign off now. It was so great talking to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us about what you do at Rainbow. We love your work. We're really impressed with your work, and
Thank you.
keep it up.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me, and for sharing your knowledge. It's yeah, it's so incredible to hear you talk about these mushrooms and their healing potentials and the ways that that's being brought to really help heal people, because it's so needed. So yeah, let's do this again. I feel like there's so much more to chat about. So yeah, thank you again, and thanks for all the questions.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Okay, we'll talk to you soon.